It was a quiet morning in the small suburban house. The soft sunlight peeked through the curtains, casting a warm glow on everything it touched. Inside, Sarah, a pregnant woman with a calm demeanor, sat on the couch, her hands resting gently on her belly. Her eyes were closed for a moment, just soaking in the peacefulness of the morning. By her side, lying as close as possible, was Buddy, a medium-sized dog with fur as golden as the sunlight streaming in. He had been with Sarah through so many ups and downs, but today, it seemed like something was different. Buddy had always been her loyal companion, the one who stayed by her side when she needed comfort or company. But this morning, there was something in the air that made Buddy uneasy. He nudged Sarah's hand gently, as if trying to tell her something. Sarah smiled down at him, ruffling his fur. "What's the matter, Buddy?" she asked softly. But Buddy didn't respond with his usual wag of the tail. Instead, his dark eyes stayed locked on her, as if reading her every move. Sarah sighed and stretched, feeling the weight of her growing belly. She had been feeling a little more tired than usual lately, but she brushed it off. She didn't want to worry too much, after all, she was just a few months from the big day. She stood up slowly, trying not to disturb Buddy, but he immediately got up and followed her. He walked beside her, keeping his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was rare for him. His tail wagged slightly, but it was slow and uncertain, as though he knew something Sarah didn't. She moved to the kitchen, trying to prepare some breakfast. The room smelled of warm toast and coffee, but as Sarah reached for the jar of peanut butter, a wave of dizziness hit her. She grabbed the counter, her hand trembling slightly. Buddy, who had been standing right behind her, gave a soft whine, his eyes widening. Sarah paused for a moment, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "I'm fine, Buddy," she whispered, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She took a deep breath and tried to focus, but the dizziness only grew stronger. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, almost dropping the jar in her hands. Buddy barked sharply, almost as if he were warning her. "Buddy, stop," she said, trying to smile, but the words felt heavy. Before she could steady herself, her legs gave out, and she collapsed, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The jar of peanut butter rolled across the kitchen, but neither of them paid attention to it. Buddy's ears perked up, his eyes wide with panic. He rushed to Sarah's side, barking loudly as he nudged her with his nose. His body trembled, and his tail was no longer wagging. It was as if the world had stopped moving, and all that mattered was Sarah. He circled her body, trying to rouse her from her unconscious state, but nothing seemed to work. The kitchen grew eerily silent, the only sound being Buddy's desperate barks and the faint hum of the refrigerator. The dog's paws tapped frantically on the floor, unsure of what to do next. His breath came fast and shallow, and his eyes were full of fear. He had never seen Sarah like this before. She had always been the one to care for him, the one who comforted him when he was scared or sad. Now, she was lying still on the cold floor, and Buddy didn't know how to fix it. The confusion in his eyes grew, and a quiet whine escaped his throat. He pawed at Sarah's face, hoping she would wake up, but she remained lifeless, her breathing shallow. Buddy stepped back, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't just sit there and wait. He had to do something. Sarah needed help, but Buddy didn't know how to get it. His body quivered as he stood in the kitchen, looking at her, then at the door, then back at her. He barked again, louder this time, hoping someone would hear. But there was no response. He rushed to the door, scratching at it, barking as loud as he could. His whole body shook with fear. If only he could find a way to get help. Buddy's barking echoed through the house, but there was no answer. His panic grew. He ran back to Sarah, sniffing her face, nudging her once more, but she remained still. There was a sudden heaviness in the air, a sense of urgency that Buddy couldn't ignore. He knew he couldn't wait any longer, he had to act. Without thinking, Buddy bolted towards the phone lying on the counter. He had seen Sarah use it countless times, and somehow, he knew it was the key to getting help. His paws scrambled on the smooth floor as he reached the counter, where Sarah had dropped the phone earlier in her rush. It was out of her reach, just a few feet away from the edge. Buddy's tail wagged nervously as he nudged the phone with his nose. He pushed it closer to the edge, and it teetered for a moment, almost falling to the floor. With a quick push, he managed to knock it down. The phone clattered to the ground, and Buddy immediately grabbed it in his mouth, dragging it across the floor. His heart pounded as he pulled the phone towards Sarah. His legs trembled, his focus sharp despite the chaos in his mind. He was so close. Buddy gently nudged the phone towards Sarah's hand, but she didn't stir. A sense of helplessness washed over him. He needed more than just the phone. He darted back to the door, barking again, hoping for some kind of miracle. But the house was quiet, the only sound being Buddy's frantic calls. Buddy paused, listening intently. He realized there was someone outside, a neighbor, walking their dog nearby. The sounds of footsteps reached his ears, and in a moment of clarity, he knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, Buddy dashed to the front door, scratching at it with renewed urgency. He barked again, louder this time, pacing in front of the door, his whole body quivering with desperation. His cries pierced the silence, and finally, he heard a response, a familiar voice calling out from outside. "Buddy, what's wrong?" It was Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor who often stopped by to check on Sarah. Buddy's ears perked up, and he barked once more, as if urging her to hurry. Mrs. Wilson hesitated for a moment, probably startled by the intensity of Buddy's behavior, but she quickly moved toward the door. As soon as she opened it, Buddy bolted outside, darting between her legs and running toward the driveway, leading her directly to Sarah. "Sarah!" Mrs. Wilson called out, rushing into the house as Buddy led her to the kitchen. She found Sarah unconscious on the floor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened in panic, but she didn't waste time. She quickly knelt beside Sarah, checking her pulse and calling 911. Buddy stood by Sarah's side, his eyes wide with concern, unable to understand what was happening but knowing, in some strange way, that everything depended on this moment. The paramedics were on their way, but the wait felt endless. Buddy stayed close to Sarah, his eyes never leaving her face. He whined softly, nudging her gently, but she still didn't respond. His fear mounted as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Seconds felt like hours, and Buddy's body seemed to be frozen with worry. He paced back and forth, looking at Sarah, then at the door, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and concern. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, and all he wanted was for Sarah to wake up and tell him everything would be okay. Then, finally, the paramedics arrived. They rushed into the house, and Buddy stepped back, standing guard but unsure of what to do. He watched them work quickly, with precision and focus, as they assessed Sarah's condition. The paramedics spoke in urgent tones, moving swiftly as they connected Sarah to equipment, monitoring her vitals. Buddy watched them carefully, still standing near her side, his body tense, his tail stiff. He kept his gaze locked on Sarah, the only person in the world who mattered to him. The paramedics moved around Sarah, their voices low and calming as they worked, but Buddy's attention was entirely on her. One of the paramedics, noticing Buddy's distress, gently spoke to him. "It's okay, boy," he said softly. "We've got her. She'll be fine." Buddy's ears perked up at the sound of the calm voice, but it didn't ease the worry in his chest. He continued to stare at Sarah, unable to look away. The room was filled with the buzz of medical equipment and the soft murmurs of the paramedics, but to Buddy, it was all just noise. Nothing mattered except Sarah. For what seemed like an eternity, Buddy stood by, watching over her, unwilling to leave her side. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, Sarah's fingers twitched. Buddy's eyes widened. She was waking up. The weight that had been crushing his heart began to lift, and he let out a small whine of relief. Slowly, Sarah opened her eyes, blinking as she looked up at the faces around her. "Sarah, you're okay," one of the paramedics said gently, a reassuring smile on his face. But Sarah's eyes were not focused on the paramedics. Instead, they drifted to the side, where Buddy was sitting, his eyes full of emotion and his tail barely moving. Her lips parted in a soft, weak smile. The moment their eyes met, Sarah's heart seemed to skip a beat. In the middle of all the chaos, there was Buddy, her brave, loyal dog, standing by her side. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love and gratitude. She raised a trembling hand and gently stroked his fur. "You saved me, didn't you?" Her voice broke slightly, emotion flooding her as she realized just how much Buddy had done for her. Buddy, as if understanding every word, nuzzled her hand with his nose, his tail slowly wagging again. And in that quiet moment, amidst all the fear and confusion, the bond between them became even stronger. Sarah's mind was still foggy, but she could feel the warmth of Buddy's fur beneath her fingers. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had been so close to losing everything, yet here was her dog, her hero, right beside her. The paramedics continued their work, but Sarah's focus was on Buddy, who had never left her side, never given up on her. She wanted to say more, to thank him properly, but words felt so small compared to the enormity of what had just happened. Buddy, though still jittery from the ordeal, seemed to understand that she needed comfort. He gently leaned into her, his head resting on her lap as if saying, "I'm here." His eyes softened, and the tension in his body slowly melted away. The world outside, the sirens, the paramedics, the chaos, faded into the background. It was just her and Buddy, together, in that small moment of quiet relief. The paramedics worked efficiently, preparing Sarah for transport to the hospital. One of them gently lifted her into the stretcher, and Buddy immediately stood up, following closely, his eyes never leaving her. He watched as they carefully moved her toward the door, his steps light but determined. It was as if he knew exactly what was at stake, and he wasn't about to leave her now. Once Sarah was in the ambulance, the paramedics made sure she was secure, but Buddy still wasn't satisfied. He stood outside, watching them through the open door, his eyes wide with concern. He paced back and forth, his tail drooping slightly, unsure of whether to stay by Sarah's side or to follow them to the hospital. The paramedics noticed Buddy's anxiety and gave each other a knowing glance. "Let him come with us," one of them suggested. "He's been with her through all of this. He's part of her recovery." Sarah heard the conversation, and despite her exhaustion, a small smile appeared on her face. "Can he really come?" she asked, her voice shaky but hopeful. "Of course," the paramedic replied. "He's your dog. He's earned it." And just like that, Buddy was allowed to ride with Sarah in the ambulance. He jumped into the back, sitting next to her, his body pressed against hers as if to reassure her that everything would be all right. His warm presence was a comfort, a reminder that even in the most terrifying moments, there was always someone who cared, someone who would never leave you. The ride to the hospital was a blur for Sarah. She could barely keep her eyes open, the exhaustion from the fainting spell and the anxiety of the situation pulling her down. But Buddy, as always, stayed alert, his eyes scanning the interior of the ambulance, keeping a watchful gaze on Sarah. Every time she stirred, he nudged her gently, as if urging her to stay awake, to stay strong. The hospital came into view, and the sirens grew louder. The ambulance pulled into the emergency entrance, and the paramedics moved quickly to get Sarah out. Buddy jumped out of the back with them, his paws hitting the pavement as he followed Sarah into the hospital. The scene was hectic, with doctors and nurses rushing to greet them, but Buddy never wavered. He stayed right next to Sarah, his loyalty unwavering, his purpose clear. In the hospital, the staff quickly moved Sarah into a room. As the doctors assessed her condition, Buddy sat by her side, his eyes fixed on her, his tail occasionally thumping softly against the floor. Sarah's eyes fluttered open once more, and the first thing she saw was Buddy, sitting patiently, watching over her. She let out a sigh of relief, her hand reaching out for him. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. The nurse, who had been watching the scene unfold, smiled softly. "It's amazing, isn't it? The bond between a dog and their owner. He knew what to do when no one else could." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Buddy. "I don't know what I would have done without him," she replied, her voice full of gratitude. "He saved my life." Buddy, as if understanding every word, let out a soft woof, his body relaxing as he sat closer to Sarah. In that moment, surrounded by the hospital's sterile walls and the soft beeping of medical machines, it was just Sarah and Buddy, two beings who had gone through something terrifying together and come out stronger for it. As the doctors continued their checks, Sarah's heart felt lighter. She knew that Buddy's loyalty, his determination, and his love had been the reason she was still here. He had given everything to protect her, and in return, she promised herself that she would never take that bond for granted. The nurses and doctors finished their work, and eventually, Sarah was given the all-clear. The baby was fine, her fainting spell was likely caused by a sudden drop in blood pressure, and with some rest, she would be good as new. But for now, there was something more important than all the medical jargon and charts, the quiet moment she shared with Buddy. The nurse turned to Sarah and said, "You're lucky to have such a smart, loyal dog." Sarah smiled softly, glancing down at Buddy, who was resting his head on her lap, his eyes closed in contentment. "He's not just my dog," she said, her voice full of love. "He's my hero." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of her voice and gave a gentle nudge, as if acknowledging her words. The bond between them was deeper than anything words could express. It was a bond built on trust, love, and the unspoken understanding that no matter what happened, they would always be there for each other. And as Sarah sat there in the hospital room, with Buddy by her side, she realized just how precious life was, and how truly extraordinary the love between a dog and their owner could be. As the hours passed, Sarah began to feel more like herself. The worst of the dizziness had faded, and the doctors assured her that, after some rest, she would be fine. But despite their reassurances, her thoughts kept drifting back to that terrifying moment in the kitchen when she had collapsed, and how Buddy had been there, always by her side, never leaving her. She glanced down at him now, still curled up at her feet, his fur soft and comforting beneath her hand. Buddy had not moved since they arrived at the hospital. He was lying there, his eyes occasionally fluttering open to make sure she was okay, but mostly just watching over her. There was no doubt in her mind, Buddy had been her lifeline, the one who had kept her from being alone in her darkest moment. "You're something special, you know that," she whispered to him. His tail thumped once in response, a soft, contented sound that brought a smile to Sarah's face. The hospital room was quiet now, the beeping of the machines the only sound. The busy bustle of the emergency room had calmed, and the nurses had gone to check on other patients. It felt strange to Sarah, how peaceful the room was now compared to the earlier chaos. She was alone, except for Buddy, but she didn't feel lonely. The weight of everything that had happened was still heavy on her, but it was lightened by the presence of her faithful companion. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn pink, the first signs of evening approaching. The warm light from the setting sun poured through the window, and Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the exhaustion take over her once more. She had been through so much today, and all she wanted was to sleep. But before she let herself rest, she needed to say something. She needed to let Buddy know just how much he meant to her. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life today. You were there when I couldn't be. You knew something was wrong before anyone else did. You knew how to get help. You're my hero." Buddy's ears perked up at her voice, and he lifted his head from her lap, his gaze steady and full of understanding. For a moment, they just looked at each other. There was no need for words, they had always communicated in ways that went beyond what was spoken. But in that moment, Sarah could see it in his eyes. He didn't need her to say it, but he appreciated the sentiment. The bond between them was unspoken but deep, and it was stronger than anything else in the world. Buddy had saved her, but in many ways, Sarah knew that Buddy had been saving her long before today. He had been her protector, her comforter, her constant source of love. And now, he was her hero, too. The door to the room opened quietly, and the nurse entered with a soft smile. "How are we feeling?" she asked, checking Sarah's vitals and making sure everything was in order. "I'm doing better, thank you," Sarah replied, her voice soft but steady. She glanced down at Buddy, who was still resting at her feet. "He's been amazing. I don't know what I would have done without him." The nurse chuckled. "Dogs are incredible," she said, her eyes warm as she glanced at Buddy. "He must be quite the dog." Sarah smiled. "He's more than just a dog. He's family. He's my protector." As the nurse left the room to give Sarah some privacy, Sarah's mind wandered back to the events of the day. The hospital, the doctors, the paramedics, all of it had been a blur. But what had stayed crystal clear was Buddy. He had been her constant. He had not left her side, not once, through the entire ordeal. He had acted without hesitation, not because he was trained to, but because of the bond they shared. The thought brought a tear to Sarah's eye. She couldn't imagine her life without him. She had always known he was special, but today, he had shown her just how extraordinary he truly was. "Thank you, Buddy," Sarah whispered, feeling the weight of her words. "You've given me more than I could ever give you. But I promise, I'll always take care of you, just like you've taken care of me." Buddy's eyes softened as he gazed up at her, and Sarah's heart swelled with love. She leaned down, her hand resting gently on his head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace in the warmth of their shared silence. For the first time that day, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. She was safe. She was not alone. And most importantly, she had Buddy, her hero, her dog, her best friend. The hospital room was quiet once again, but now, it felt different. It felt like home. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. And as she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Buddy, curled up at her feet, guarding her heart the way he always had. And so, in the quiet of that room, with the evening light fading gently outside the window, Sarah and Buddy rested, side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits, checkups, and quiet moments spent with Buddy by her side. Sarah slowly recovered, her strength returning with each passing hour. The fainting spell had been caused by a sudden drop in her blood pressure, likely from the stresses of her pregnancy, and after some rest and careful monitoring, the doctors were confident that she would be just fine. But Sarah couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of gratitude she felt for Buddy. It wasn't just that he had saved her life, it was the way he had done it. His instincts had kicked in when it mattered most, and he had done what no one else could have done. Sarah often found herself staring at Buddy, lost in thought as she marveled at how much her life had been shaped by him. They had been through so much together, good times, bad times, quiet moments, and loud ones. But this was different. What had happened that day had changed everything. Buddy had shown her just how deeply he understood her, how attuned he was to her needs. He had saved her, but he had also reminded her of the power of their bond. It was a sunny afternoon when Sarah finally felt strong enough to leave the hospital. She had been discharged, and although she was still a little tired, she couldn't wait to get home. As the nurse wheeled her out of the room, Buddy walked at her side, his body tense but steady, always close, always watching over her. "Thank you for everything," Sarah said to the nurse, her voice full of appreciation. "Take care of yourself," the nurse replied, smiling warmly. "And don't forget to take care of that dog, too. He's a special one." Buddy wagged his tail at the mention of his name, as if he understood exactly what was being said. Sarah laughed softly and gently rubbed his head. "I promise," she said, her heart full of love for him. "I'll never forget." They made their way to the front of the hospital, where a friend was waiting to take them home. Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her as she saw her car waiting, knowing that soon, she'd be back in the comfort of her own space with Buddy. The drive home was quiet, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the way Buddy had acted in those critical moments. How he had gone above and beyond, pushing past his own fears to make sure she was safe. It made her heart swell with love and admiration. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Buddy leapt out of the car the moment it stopped, his excitement palpable. He darted up the walkway, his tail wagging furiously as he bounded toward the door. Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of comfort at the sight. He had always been energetic, always ready for action. But today, he seemed even more eager, as if he knew this was a special moment, home, together, safe. Sarah slowly stepped out of the car, feeling a little unsteady on her feet, but Buddy was there, his gentle presence beside her as he guided her inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, it felt like a weight had lifted off her shoulders. This was where she belonged, with Buddy, in the place that had always felt like home. As she sat down on the couch, Buddy immediately curled up beside her, resting his head in her lap as if to say, "I've got you." She ran her fingers through his soft fur, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. Her thoughts drifted to the future. The baby. The family they would soon be welcoming. And Buddy, her constant, her protector. She had always known how much he loved her, how much he cared. But after what had happened, she realized just how deep that love went. He wasn't just a dog. He was a part of her heart, a part of her life, and nothing would ever change that. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself growing more and more relaxed in the comfort of her home. The warmth of the sun through the windows, the quiet hum of the house, it all felt perfect. And Buddy, always so in tune with her, seemed to sense her calmness. He lay beside her, his body pressed against hers, offering her the quiet comfort that only he could provide. His presence was enough to make the world feel right again. In the days that followed, Sarah began to feel stronger. She was able to go for short walks, take care of herself, and prepare for the arrival of her baby. And through it all, Buddy was there, his unwavering loyalty a constant source of strength. Whether it was lying next to her while she rested, walking beside her as she took those first tentative steps outside, or simply sitting quietly at her feet, Buddy's presence was a balm for her soul. Each night, as Sarah lay in bed, Buddy curled up at the foot of her bed, just like he always did. She would smile as she looked down at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude that words could never fully express. She had been given a second chance, thanks to him. And as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Because in Buddy, she had found not just a dog, but a partner, someone who would protect her, love her, and stand by her side through it all. And in return, she would do the same for him, for the rest of their days. Weeks passed, and Sarah's life began to fall into a new rhythm. She had fully recovered from the fainting spell, and her pregnancy was progressing smoothly. With each passing day, the bond between her and Buddy grew even stronger. It was as if they had both learned something from the experience, something deep and unspoken. Sarah knew that Buddy had always been special, but now, she saw him in a new light. He wasn't just a pet, he was her guardian, her protector, and in many ways, the unsung hero of their little family. The days were filled with small, quiet moments, Buddy always by her side, his presence grounding her. When she spent time preparing the nursery for the baby, Buddy would sit in the doorway, his eyes following every movement she made. Sometimes, he would nudge her with his nose, as if offering encouragement, his silent way of saying, "You're doing great." Sarah smiled every time, her heart full of gratitude. It was these little gestures that meant so much, those moments where Buddy communicated everything he needed to with just a glance, a touch, or a soft nudge. There was no need for words between them, their connection spoke volumes. One afternoon, as Sarah was unpacking baby clothes in the nursery, she heard a soft knock on the door. Her friend, Emily, stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers and a big smile on her face. "I brought you some flowers," Emily said, stepping inside. "How are you feeling? You look great." "Thank you, I'm doing much better," Sarah replied with a smile. "And the baby's doing well too. Just getting everything ready." Emily looked around, admiring the cozy nursery Sarah had put together. "It's perfect," she said, then looked at Buddy, who was sitting in the corner, his watchful eyes following every movement. "And how's the best dog in the world doing?" Buddy wagged his tail and let out a soft bark, as if in greeting. He had always been friendly with Emily, but today, there was something different in his gaze. It was as though he knew something they didn't. "He's great," Sarah said, smiling. "He's been my rock through everything. I honestly don't know what I would have done without him." Emily gave a knowing nod. "I can tell. There's something special about him. He's not just your dog, is he? His family." Sarah nodded, her heart swelling at the truth of those words. Exactly. He's been with me through so much. He's more than just a pet. He's been my companion, my protector, and now, he's going to be a big brother. Emily chuckled softly, glancing at Buddy with affection. Well, I think he's more than ready for that role. As the two women chatted about the baby and preparations for the future, Buddy stayed close, moving between them with a quiet presence. Every so often, he would nudge Sarah's hand, asking for a little attention, a gentle pet on the head. It was his way of reminding her that, no matter how much had changed, some things remained the same. As evening came, Sarah and Emily sat down in the living room, sipping tea and chatting about the challenges and joys of motherhood. Buddy, now curled up on the couch beside Sarah, kept one eye on the window, ever watchful, ever aware of the world around him. But there was something different in his behavior, something Sarah had noticed over the past few days. Buddy had been more protective lately. He seemed to sense that something was approaching, something beyond the ordinary. Later that night, after Emily had left and Sarah had gone to bed, Buddy settled in at the foot of her bed as usual. But tonight, he didn't seem to settle as quickly as he normally did. He shifted restlessly, his eyes scanning the room with an intensity Sarah hadn't seen before. She glanced down at him, concern creeping into her chest. "Buddy," she whispered softly. "What's wrong?" He looked up at her, his eyes steady, as if trying to tell her something. Sarah reached down and stroked his head gently, but Buddy remained tense, his ears alert. Something felt different in the air, but Sarah couldn't quite place it. She tried to ignore the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. But she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach. Buddy, sensing her distress, let out a soft, low whine, as if to reassure her. She reached down and gave him a long, comforting scratch behind the ears. "You're always looking out for me, aren't you?" she said quietly. Buddy's tail thumped once in response, and he finally seemed to relax, settling down on the bed next to her. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. It was almost as if Buddy knew something that she didn't. The night passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't sleep soundly. She lay awake for hours, thinking about everything that had happened, the fainting spell, the hospital, and how Buddy had been the one constant throughout it all. He had always been there when she needed him most. And now, as her due date grew nearer, she couldn't help but wonder what else he might be sensing, what else he might be preparing for. The next morning, Sarah decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would help clear her mind. Buddy walked beside her, as always, his watchful eyes scanning everything around them. But today, he seemed even more alert than usual. He kept a few steps ahead, his body tense and ready for anything. "Buddy, what's going on?" Sarah murmured, but he just kept walking, his pace steady, his attention never wavering. It was then that Sarah felt it, something was off. The world around her felt quiet, too quiet. She looked down at Buddy, who had stopped in his tracks, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. And in that moment, Sarah realized that Buddy wasn't just reacting to her pregnancy or the changes in their life. He was sensing something else, something she couldn't yet see. A chill ran down her spine as she followed his gaze. Whatever it was, she knew that Buddy was ready to protect her, no matter what. The air seemed to shift around them, thick with an unspoken tension. Buddy stood motionless, his eyes locked on the distance, his body stiff with readiness. Sarah followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. The street was quiet, as it always was at this hour, with only the occasional car passing by. But Buddy wasn't one to be easily fooled. She trusted him, he had never been wrong before. "Buddy?" Sarah whispered, her voice low and uncertain. "What is it, boy?" Buddy's ears flicked back, and his tail remained rigid. He let out a soft growl, a sound Sarah had rarely heard from him. It wasn't aggressive, but it was filled with purpose. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. Her heart began to race, and she instinctively took a step back, looking down at Buddy, whose stance was unwavering. Suddenly, there was a sound, a rustling from behind a row of bushes along the sidewalk. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. Buddy's growl grew louder, his stance even more defensive. He took a small step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah, as if to shield her from whatever threat was lurking in the shadows. The rustling stopped for a moment, and all was silent. Sarah's mind raced, but her body remained frozen, her eyes fixed on Buddy. She knew she had to stay calm. Buddy was the one who would protect her, but it was up to her to stay composed. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Sarah noticed movement, a figure stepping out from behind the bushes. Her heart skipped a beat as the person emerged into the light. It was a man, wearing a hooded jacket, his face partially obscured by the hood. He looked disheveled, his clothes worn and dirty, and there was an air of desperation about him. Buddy immediately moved forward, his hackles raised, his eyes fixed on the man with a sense of caution. Sarah instinctively took a step back, but she kept her eyes on the man, trying to assess the situation. The man stopped a few feet away, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said in a low, gravelly voice, his eyes darting nervously between Sarah and Buddy. I just need some help." Sarah's heart began to pound in her chest. She could see the fear in the man's eyes, but something about his presence made her uneasy. Buddy, sensing her hesitation, growled again, the sound low and firm. The man flinched at the sound but didn't move closer. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he continued, his voice shaky. He seemed to be searching for words. "I need directions. I'm lost, and I've been walking for hours. I don't know where I am." Sarah glanced down at Buddy, whose eyes never left the man. His posture was tense, but there was no sign of aggression yet. Buddy was waiting for Sarah to make the call. Sarah's instincts were screaming at her to be cautious, but the man did seem lost, genuinely confused and in need of help. Sarah began, but before she could finish her sentence, Buddy took a step forward, his body blocking Sarah's path. His eyes were fixed on the man with a cold intensity, and he bared his teeth, his growl rising to a more menacing level. "Buddy," Sarah said quietly, her voice tinged with both reassurance and concern. "It's okay, Buddy. Stay with me." But Buddy was having none of it. His protective instincts had taken over, and he wasn't going to let anyone near Sarah without his approval. The man seemed to sense Buddy's hostility and took another step back, his hands still raised. "I understand," he said quickly, his voice now trembling. "I won't bother you. I'll just go." He turned to leave, glancing over his shoulder one last time before quickly disappearing down the street. Buddy didn't relax immediately. He stood still, his eyes locked on the space where the man had vanished. Only once he was certain the stranger was gone did Buddy slowly lower his guard, his body relaxing but still remaining alert. His eyes returned to Sarah, watching her closely, as if making sure she was okay. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart still racing in her chest. The tension in the air had yet to dissipate, but Buddy's presence grounded her. She knelt down slowly to meet his gaze, her hand running over his fur in gratitude. "You were right," she whispered. "You always know when something's wrong, don't you?" Buddy's tail thumped softly against the pavement, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. There was no need for words, he knew exactly what he had to do. His job was to protect Sarah, and he would do that until his last breath. Sarah took a deep breath and glanced down the street, making sure the man was truly gone. She then stood up and continued walking with Buddy, who remained close beside her, every step in sync with hers. His protective nature hadn't faltered, and she felt a deep sense of security in his presence. As they made their way back home, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood. The peaceful surroundings felt almost surreal after the tension they had just experienced. But Sarah knew that as long as Buddy was by her side, she would never be truly alone. No matter what came their way, he would always be there to protect her, and the baby that was on the way. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Sarah's thoughts lingered on the encounter. Something about that man, about the way Buddy had reacted, felt off. But for now, there was peace. For now, they were safe. And as Sarah sat down on the couch that evening, Buddy curled up at her feet, she couldn't help but think about how lucky she was. She had Buddy, her guardian angel in the form of a dog, always watching over her, always keeping her safe. And no matter what the future held, Sarah knew they were ready to face it, together. The following days seemed to pass in a blur for Sarah. Between preparing for the baby's arrival and adjusting to the new sense of awareness Buddy had instilled in her, she found herself constantly thinking about what had happened that afternoon. The man's sudden appearance, his desperate eyes, and the way Buddy had reacted, everything felt like a warning. But a warning for what? What exactly had Buddy sensed? The questions lingered in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing on what she could control, the baby, the home, and her constant companion, Buddy. However, there was no escaping the growing sense of unease. It wasn't just about the man anymore, it was something deeper, something Buddy had tapped into that Sarah couldn't quite place. She had always known Buddy to be protective, but now, it felt like his instincts were heightened, as if something was coming that they weren't prepared for. One night, after a long day of organizing baby items and setting up the nursery, Sarah found herself sitting alone in the living room, a cup of tea in hand. Buddy had been unusually restless, pacing back and forth, his eyes darting toward the window every few minutes. It was as though he was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. Sarah knew it wasn't the typical evening energy she was used to. "Buddy," she said softly, glancing at him. "What's going on, boy? You're acting strange." Buddy didn't respond the way he usually did. Instead of coming over to her side, laying his head on her lap, or curling up at her feet, he simply kept watch. His focus was unwavering, his ears alert to every little sound. Suddenly, a knock on the door echoed through the quiet house. Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Buddy immediately went on high alert, his body tense, his growl low but steady. Sarah felt a rush of anxiety flood her chest. She wasn't sure what to do. The man from a few days ago flashed in her mind, and her instincts told her to be cautious. The knock came again, this time more insistent. She stood up slowly, glancing down at Buddy, who was now standing between her and the door, his stance protective. "Easy, boy," she whispered, but Buddy wasn't having it. His growl deepened, and he took a few steps forward, clearly unwilling to let anyone close without checking them first. Taking a deep breath, Sarah slowly approached the door. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the dark, empty night. Her stomach twisted with a feeling she couldn't explain. She hesitated, then cracked the door open just a fraction, enough to see outside but still be able to retreat if she needed to. Buddy stood firm beside her, his watchful eyes scanning the darkness. "Hello?" Sarah called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" A voice came back, low and gravelly, eerily familiar. "It's me. Please, let me in." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was the same man from before. The same desperate tone, the same fear in his voice. But something felt different now. The sense of urgency in his voice made her pulse quicken. Her mind raced, trying to decide whether to trust him or to close the door and lock herself inside. Buddy stepped forward again, pressing his body against Sarah's leg. His growl was now unmistakable, low, steady, filled with intent. He wasn't going to let anyone near her without a very good reason. Sarah placed a hand on his head, trying to calm him, but Buddy wasn't backing down. It was clear that Buddy didn't trust this man. And if Buddy didn't trust him, neither did she. "Go away," Sarah called firmly, her voice strong now. "I'm not letting you in." The man's voice shook. "Please, you don't understand. I'm not here to hurt you. It's not safe out here. You need to help me. Please." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The man's plea felt genuine, but she wasn't convinced. The fear in his voice didn't sit right with her. Why was he here again? Why was he so insistent on coming inside when he had already left once? Something was off, and her gut was telling her not to trust him. "Not tonight." "I said, go away," Sarah repeated, her voice more forceful. "I don't know who you are, and I don't want any trouble." Buddy's growl intensified. He was clearly in protective mode, and Sarah couldn't help but feel grateful for that. He was her guardian, and she trusted him more than anyone else in that moment. The man on the other side of the door fell silent for a moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke again, but this time his voice was filled with a quiet, resigned sadness. "Fine," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you'll see. You'll see soon enough." Before Sarah could react, the man was gone. There was no more knocking, no more sounds. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Buddy's body relaxed, his growl fading into a low whimper as he returned to Sarah's side, his eyes still watchful but no longer tense. Sarah stood there for a few moments, her mind racing with what had just happened. Was it over? Was he really gone? She slowly closed the door, bolting it shut behind her. The feeling of dread still lingered in the air, and Buddy's protective instincts were still on high alert. She looked down at him, her heart heavy with concern. "Buddy, what's going on? Why does he keep coming back?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Buddy gave a soft woof and nudged her hand with his nose, as if reassuring her that he was there, and he would always keep her safe. Sarah smiled weakly and reached down to pet him. He was her rock, her protector. And she knew that no matter what, she wasn't facing this alone. But as the night wore on and Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man's warning wasn't just empty words. Something was coming. And it wasn't just the unknown figure from earlier, it was something far bigger, something Buddy was sensing that she hadn't yet realized. She closed her eyes, holding onto the warmth of Buddy's presence beside her. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The next morning, Sarah woke to the soft warmth of the sun streaming through the curtains. The house was quiet, but there was still an unsettling tension in the air, a residue from the night before. Buddy was lying beside her, his body pressed against the bed, but even in sleep, he seemed different, more alert, as though his senses never fully rested. Sarah carefully slid out of bed, trying not to disturb him, but his eyes flickered open the moment her feet touched the floor. He looked up at her, his gaze intense and steady, his tail giving a small wag as if to say, "I'm here, always watching over you." Sarah smiled softly, her hand reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I know, Buddy. I know." As she moved about the house, getting ready for the day, the strange feeling from the night before lingered. The man had left, but his words echoed in her mind. "You'll see soon enough." What had he meant by that? Was there something more coming? And why was Buddy reacting like he knew something she didn't? Despite the unease, Sarah pushed forward with her day. The baby was due soon, and there was so much to prepare. She needed to stay focused, for both her sake and her baby's. But as she moved through the house, tidying up the kitchen and organizing the baby's things, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of reach, something important, like a puzzle piece that hadn't quite clicked into place. Buddy followed her everywhere, never straying too far. His eyes scanned every corner of the house, and every time Sarah stopped to do something, he would stand quietly beside her, always within arm's reach, his presence a comforting constant. In the afternoon, Sarah decided to take a break from organizing. She sat down on the couch with a book, trying to relax, but Buddy was on edge. He paced back and forth in front of her, stopping occasionally to nudge her with his nose. She laughed softly, reaching out to rub his head. "What is it, boy? What's got you so worked up today?" But Buddy didn't answer with his usual affectionate nudge. Instead, he stopped right in front of her, his eyes locked on the door. His ears were back, his body stiff and rigid. It was as if he had heard something she couldn't hear. "Buddy?" Sarah whispered, her voice growing thick with concern. The way Buddy was acting, she could feel the tension rising in the room again. She stood up, following his gaze to the door, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And Buddy's body language only confirmed it. Just then, there was a knock. A single, sharp knock that echoed through the quiet house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to race as she looked down at Buddy, who was now standing directly in front of the door, his body rigid and protective. The knock had been soft, almost gentle, but there was an unmistakable urgency to it. "Not again," Sarah muttered to herself, feeling a wave of dread wash over her. Was it the same man again? Had he come back? Or was it something worse? Buddy's growl started low, deep in his chest, and Sarah could see his muscles tense as he prepared to protect her. His instinct was clear, he wasn't going to let anyone near her without his approval, and that was something she had learned to trust completely. She hesitated, looking down at Buddy. He was ready. He had always been ready to defend her. Sarah couldn't ignore the protective nature that had saved her before, but now, she felt like she needed to do something more. She had to take control. "Stay here," she whispered to Buddy, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. She reached for the doorknob, but as her hand touched it, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. A chill ran down her spine. She looked at Buddy one last time, and he didn't move an inch, his eyes never leaving the door. Sarah took a deep breath, then slowly opened the door just a crack. The same man stood there again, but this time, his face was different. The fear was gone, replaced by something much darker, a sense of desperation that bordered on panic. "Please, you have to listen to me," the man said, his voice shaking. "It's not safe anymore. They're coming. They won't stop. You need to get out of here." The words made Sarah's blood run cold. They were the same words from the night before, but now they were even more urgent. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm, but her mind was racing. "Who's coming? Who are you?" The man's eyes darted over his shoulder, as if he feared being seen. He stepped forward a little, but Buddy immediately moved between them, blocking the man's path, his growl deep and unwavering. The man froze, his eyes widening with fear at Buddy's reaction. I told you," he stammered, "I'm not here to hurt you. But there's no time. You have to listen." Sarah glanced at Buddy, his protective stance unyielding. She couldn't ignore what he was trying to tell her. She trusted Buddy's instincts above all else. But at the same time, the man's words were impossible to ignore. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice firm now. "And what do you want from me?" The man seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking between Sarah and Buddy. Then, he took a deep breath and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "They're coming for you, the ones who did this to me. They know about you now. They know about your baby. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Before Sarah could respond, Buddy let out a sharp, warning bark, and the man took a step back, his face pale with fear. He turned quickly, as if something had made him change his mind, and in a split second, he was gone, disappearing into the shadows once again. Buddy's growl subsided, but he didn't move from his position, his eyes still scanning the space around them. Sarah stood there, stunned, her heart hammering in her chest. The man's words replayed in her mind. "They're coming for you. They know about your baby." Was it just a threat? Or had Buddy sensed something far more dangerous, something she couldn't see yet? As Sarah closed the door, she looked down at Buddy. "What do we do now, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Buddy gave a soft woof and nuzzled her hand, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. Whatever was coming, she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't facing it alone. The day passed in a blur of nervous energy, each moment stretching longer than the last. Sarah couldn't shake the unease that gripped her. The man's warning echoed in her mind like a dark cloud that wouldn't dissipate, and Buddy's unyielding protectiveness only made the situation feel more real. She had to trust him. She always had, and his instincts had never been wrong. But what was coming? And why? These questions lingered like shadows in her thoughts, and no matter how hard she tried to push them away, they wouldn't go. Buddy remained close to her at all times. His watchful eyes were never far from Sarah, as if he was silently urging her to stay alert, to be ready for whatever was coming next. She couldn't remember the last time he'd left her side. Even when she went into the kitchen to make herself a quick dinner, Buddy sat by the door, his eyes fixed on the outside, waiting for the next movement, the next sign. That evening, after a simple meal, Sarah decided to take a walk outside. The fresh air would do her some good, she thought, and Buddy could stretch his legs as well. Though she hesitated for a moment, remembering the strange occurrences of the last few days, Sarah convinced herself that it would be fine, just a short walk around the block, something to clear her mind. Buddy, however, wasn't having it. The moment Sarah grabbed her jacket and stepped toward the door, Buddy's eyes locked on her, his stance rigid. He gave a low whimper and planted himself in front of her, blocking her path. "Buddy, it's just a walk," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm, as if trying to reassure both herself and him. "It'll be quick. Just a little fresh air." But Buddy remained immovable, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. His growl rumbled softly in his chest. Sarah's heart sank. She had seen this behavior before, when Buddy sensed something dangerous, when he felt that it wasn't safe for her to be outside. And his reaction now, the deep, unsettling growl, only confirmed that his instincts were on high alert again. She felt the weight of his concern, and despite the nagging need to step outside and clear her head, she couldn't bring herself to ignore him. All right, Sarah sighed, dropping her jacket back on the couch. "I'll stay inside." Buddy's body relaxed slightly, but his eyes never strayed far from the door. He still wasn't fully at ease, as if he expected something to happen, and his vigilance never faltered. The evening wore on, and Sarah found herself unable to focus on anything. She couldn't stop thinking about the man's warning, about Buddy's reaction. Something was coming, and Sarah felt that she had no control over it. No matter how many preparations she made for the baby, no matter how safe her home was supposed to be, there was an invisible threat, waiting just beyond her door. As the night grew darker, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. The house was quiet, the only sound being the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Buddy lay beside her bed, his body curled up but his eyes wide open, scanning every inch of the room. Every so often, he would shift his position, his ears perking up at the slightest sound. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of his vigilance, as if he was constantly on guard for something she couldn't see. Then, at the stroke of midnight, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, unmistakable. It came from outside. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and before she could even process what was happening, Buddy was on his feet, his eyes locked on the door. His growl rumbled deep in his chest, a warning that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The tapping continued. It was too precise to be random. And it wasn't just a knock. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Sarah's mind raced. She glanced down at Buddy, who was now at full attention, his body tense and ready. She knew what he was sensing. The same instinct that had protected her in the past was warning her now. Whatever was outside, it wasn't good. "Stay close, Buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She slowly crept toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Whatever was out there, Buddy knew it was dangerous. And Sarah knew she had to be ready. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the next sound, her eyes fixed on the door as though she could will the danger away. Buddy's body was taut, his hackles raised, and his eyes never left the door. It was as if he could sense something that Sarah couldn't. His entire being was focused, waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, the door rattled. It wasn't a normal rattle, it was as if someone was trying to force their way inside. The sound made Sarah's blood run cold, and she instinctively took a step back, her eyes wide in terror. Buddy's growl intensified, his stance shifting as though he was preparing to protect her at all costs. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling but desperate to sound brave. There was no answer. Only the rattling, and the unsettling silence that followed. Sarah felt her stomach twist with fear. She didn't know who was out there, or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure, Buddy was her protector, and whatever came next, he would keep her safe. The rattling stopped. Just as quickly as it had started, everything fell silent again. Sarah's pulse raced, and she felt like she was going to collapse under the weight of her fear. She turned to Buddy, whose eyes never wavered from the door. He was still ready, still alert. She reached down to pet him, her hand shaking as she ran her fingers through his fur, grateful for his presence. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the calm before the storm. With one last glance at the door, Sarah whispered, "Stay with me, Buddy. Please." Buddy's tail gave a small thump on the floor, but he didn't move. He remained on guard, protecting her without question. The night dragged on, and Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She had to trust that Buddy would know what to do, but the fear of the unknown was suffocating. The man had warned her. Buddy had warned her. Something was coming, and it was coming for her. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The morning arrived like any other, but for Sarah, it felt like an eternity had passed since that rattling night. The house was eerily quiet, yet the tension that had built up in the last few days hung in the air like a heavy fog. Buddy was still at her side, just as vigilant as before. His watchful eyes followed her every movement, his ears perked at every sound, and his posture was always alert. There was no escaping the fact that whatever had been lurking outside her door the night before was still out there, waiting. Sarah tried to focus on her daily routine, but her mind kept returning to the events that had unfolded. She couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger, and Buddy's unwavering protection only heightened her sense of unease. She could tell he wasn't just being cautious, he was reacting to something real, something she couldn't yet comprehend. She knew she had to listen to him, but she was torn between wanting to protect her peace and acknowledging the strange, growing threat. As she went about her morning, getting ready for the day, Sarah couldn't help but glance nervously at the door. The knocking. The tapping. It was all too much, and her mind kept racing with possibilities. What if the man's warning was true? What if the danger wasn't just outside, but had already started to close in on them? Buddy's presence at her side brought some comfort, but even he seemed to sense that something was wrong. He stayed close, never straying too far, his gaze constantly shifting toward the window. His heightened sense of awareness was unmistakable, and it only added to Sarah's growing anxiety. After breakfast, she decided to take a walk to clear her head. She couldn't stay cooped up inside forever, especially with the baby coming soon. The fresh air might help. But as she opened the door, Buddy stepped forward, his body tense, his tail rigid. "No, Buddy," Sarah whispered softly. "We've been through this already. I'm just going to walk around the block. You can come with me, but I need a break." Buddy's growl rumbled deep in his chest, and his eyes never left her. He stood between her and the door, as though daring her to push him aside. It was clear that he wasn't going to let her leave without a fight. "Come on, Buddy," Sarah said gently, bending down to stroke his fur. "I'm not going far. Just a little walk." But Buddy wasn't having it. He stood his ground, unwavering, his expression that of pure concern. Sarah could see the loyalty in his eyes. He wasn't going to let her walk out there alone, not while he sensed something was wrong. Realizing that it was pointless to argue, Sarah closed the door with a quiet sigh and sat back down. She couldn't force Buddy to let her go, and honestly, the thought of walking outside alone in the current state of things terrified her. She couldn't explain it, but she trusted Buddy's instincts more than her own. If he said it wasn't safe, then she had no choice but to listen. The morning passed, and Sarah tried to distract herself with chores, anything to keep her mind from wandering back to the unsettling events of the past few days. But each time she glanced at Buddy, she felt the same unease creeping up her spine. The sense of danger was palpable. The baby, her home, and even her own safety were now tied to the constant vigilance that Buddy maintained. In the afternoon, as Sarah was cleaning the kitchen, she heard something faint, a rustling sound, something subtle, but enough to make her stop in her tracks. She looked down at Buddy, whose body had gone completely still, his ears trained on the sound. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The house felt too quiet. She wasn't imagining it, something was out of place. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What is it, boy?" Buddy stood rigid, his body leaning toward the source of the sound. His eyes fixed on the back door, his tail stiff and unmoving. For the first time, Sarah saw him act almost like a sentinel, waiting, watching, listening. The rustling continued, followed by a faint scratching noise, as though someone, or something, was attempting to climb the back wall of the house. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare move, not yet. She couldn't bring herself to check the back door immediately, but the pressure of her anxiety built in her chest. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number, someone, anyone, who could help. But before the call could even connect, Buddy's growl broke the silence. It was low, deep, and filled with warning. And then, there was a loud bang, a sharp, forceful knock on the back door. The sound reverberated through the house, making Sarah jump. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she turned to Buddy, who was already in motion, his body tense and ready for whatever was on the other side. The back door rattled again, louder this time, and Sarah instinctively backed away. The fear and uncertainty that had been gnawing at her all week hit her in full force. Something was coming. She didn't know what it was, but Buddy did. He was the one who had been sensing this, warning her. But how much longer could they stay safe? Buddy stood firm, not moving an inch as he positioned himself between Sarah and the door. His stance was unmistakable. He wasn't going to let anything through, no matter what. "Stay close, Buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. The knocking continued, relentless, as if whatever was on the other side was determined to get in. But there was no answer, no voice calling out. Just that sharp, pounding knock, again and again. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't stay in the house forever, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't facing this alone. Buddy was her protector. He had saved her before, and he was doing it again now. But what were they up against? The pounding on the door continued, and Sarah knew that soon, she would have to make a choice. Would she open the door and face whatever was out there, or would she lock herself in, hoping it would all go away? But deep down, she knew there was no escaping it. Whatever was out there wasn't just going to go away. And as Buddy's growl echoed through the house, Sarah braced herself for what was about to come. They were about to face the unknown together. The loud, insistent knocks on the back door filled the house with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Each thud echoed in Sarah's mind, sending shockwaves of fear through her chest. Buddy's low growl never ceased, and he remained steadfast, his body a protective shield between her and the door. Sarah's heart was racing. She had never felt more vulnerable, and yet, the presence of Buddy at her side was the only thing keeping her grounded. She stood frozen, unable to move, as the knocks came again, faster, louder, more desperate. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't going to stop until it had made itself known. Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing in on her, suffocating her every thought. Her instincts told her to run, to hide, but Buddy's watchful eyes kept her from acting on that impulse. "Buddy," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "What is it? What's out there?" Buddy's eyes never left the door, and his growl deepened, vibrating through the air. His stance was resolute, his body taut, as if he knew something she didn't. Every fiber of his being was focused on the threat outside, and Sarah knew, with an almost unsettling certainty, that he would protect her no matter what. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Something terrible was happening, and she couldn't stay locked inside forever. The knocking stopped abruptly, plunging the house into a suffocating silence. For a moment, Sarah thought she might be imagining things, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She knew this wasn't over. Something was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Buddy's ears perked, his body tensing even more. His eyes flicked toward the window next to the door, then back to Sarah. He was trying to tell her something, and as much as Sarah wanted to keep the door shut, she knew she had to act. With a shaky breath, she stepped back toward the window and slowly pulled aside the curtain. The view outside was dark, the street barely illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamps. It was too quiet, too still. No one was in sight, but Sarah felt the weight of someone, or something, watching her from the shadows. Before she could pull away, Buddy barked sharply, a warning that cut through the silence. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she spun to face him. His eyes were locked on the window now, his body poised, ready to spring into action. And then, she saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving slowly and deliberately toward the house. At first, it seemed like just another shadow, but as it came closer, Sarah's stomach dropped. It was a man, tall, cloaked, and shrouded in darkness. The man's face was obscured by a hood, but his intentions were clear. He was coming for her. Coming for them. "Buddy!" Sarah gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Buddy's ears flattened against his head, and his growl intensified. He was ready to defend her, but Sarah felt her pulse quicken, a wave of panic rising inside her. She backed away from the window, her heart racing. The man reached the door and placed his hand on the handle, his fingers curling around the metal with an eerie calmness. The rattling of the handle made Sarah's blood run cold. It was happening again, the same pressure, the same feeling of something about to break through. Buddy darted toward the door, his body blocking it entirely. He stood tall, his teeth bared, his growl like a warning shot in the night. "Stay back," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "Stay away from the door." The man didn't respond. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He simply stood there, his presence looming, as if daring her to challenge him. The only thing that stood between Sarah and this dark figure was Buddy, and she knew that Buddy would never let anything happen to her. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what if it wasn't enough? What if Buddy couldn't protect her from whatever was on the other side of that door? Her thoughts raced, but her instincts told her that she couldn't just stand there and wait. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed the only number she could think of, the police. As she waited for the line to connect, the silence of the house seemed to stretch into infinity. The seconds felt like hours. 911, what's your emergency? Came a calm voice on the other end. I don't know what's happening, Sarah stammered, her voice barely audible. Someone's outside my house. They won't leave. Please, you have to send help. We're sending officers to your location. Stay inside and lock all doors. Can you tell me more about the person outside? Sarah's hand trembled as she pressed the phone tighter to her ear. I can't see his face, she whispered, her breath quick and shallow. But he's here. He's trying to get in. Stay calm. Help is on the way. Can you barricade yourself in a room? I'm in the living room. My dog is here. He's protecting me. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but it was true. Buddy was everything right now. As she spoke to the operator, the man outside continued to stand motionless, his hand still on the door handle. Sarah's stomach twisted in knots. What was he waiting for? Why didn't he just break in? Suddenly, a sharp bark from Buddy interrupted her thoughts. He lunged toward the door, his body tense, as if ready to fight. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the dog, knowing that whatever happened next would be a defining moment for both of them. The door rattled again, this time more violently. The man on the other side was growing impatient. And Sarah had a feeling that this wouldn't end without a fight. With a surge of fear, Sarah moved quickly to the back of the room, glancing around for anything she could use to protect herself if the man managed to get through. Her eyes landed on the fireplace poker. It was the only thing within reach, and with trembling hands, she grabbed it. It was heavy, solid. If she had to, she would fight back. The door rattled one more time, and Sarah held her breath, the weight of the moment almost suffocating her. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. There was a long, tense silence. The man outside was gone. Buddy stopped growling, his body slowly relaxing, but he didn't let his guard down completely. His eyes remained on the door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. Sarah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps, her legs weak from the tension. She slowly let the poker drop from her hands and sank to the floor. She had survived. But for how long? Buddy, she whispered, her voice breaking. We're safe, for now. Buddy padded over to her, his warm body pressing against her side as if to reassure her that, for the moment, they were okay. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The night that followed was one of the longest Sarah had ever endured. The hours dragged on, each minute heavier than the last, as the eerie silence outside seemed to echo through the walls of the house. Buddy remained by her side, never straying far, his watchful eyes never leaving the door. It was as if he, too, was holding his breath, waiting for something she couldn't yet understand. Sarah couldn't shake the unease in her chest. The man outside hadn't said a word, but his presence had been enough. It was like he had known just how to make her feel as though she was being hunted, watched from every corner. She could still feel the weight of those eyes on her, even though the night had fallen quiet again. The phone call to the police had been short, but it hadn't brought any comfort. They promised help was on the way, but how long would it take? The house felt too isolated, too far from the nearest help. She couldn't afford to wait. And yet, even though Buddy's constant vigilance kept her from feeling entirely alone, she still had the nagging feeling that something more was coming. She wasn't out of danger. Not yet. The minutes passed, dragging into hours. Sarah found herself pacing, her mind racing, unable to keep still. Her thoughts circled back to the warning the man had given her. The one that had seemed so cryptic but now felt dangerously real. He had said they weren't safe. Was he referring to the man outside her door? Or was there something more to this threat that she hadn't yet discovered? She glanced down at Buddy, who was now lying on the floor, his eyes closed but his ears perked. The stillness in the house was unsettling, and for a moment, Sarah almost wished for the noise to return. At least then, she would know what she was dealing with. But even as she thought that, a sharp sound cut through the silence, a thud, soft at first but unmistakable. It came from outside. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone was there. Her breath caught in her throat. Buddy's head shot up immediately, his ears standing at attention. His body tensed, his muscles coiled as though ready to spring. He was alert, his focus razor-sharp. Sarah barely dared to breathe as she turned toward the window, heart hammering in her chest. The faint shadow of a figure moved across the yard, and Sarah's throat tightened. This time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, and it was real. Her mind raced for answers, but there was only one thing she knew for sure: whoever was out there, they were closer than before. Buddy stood up, his low growl rumbling in the back of his throat. He moved toward the door cautiously, his body tense and ready. Sarah felt a jolt of panic surge through her, but she knew she had to trust Buddy. He had already proven he could protect her, but she feared that this time, the threat was greater than she could imagine. She grabbed her phone again, trying to call the police, but the call wouldn't connect. Her heart sank. The signal had dropped. Of course. She was too far out in the country for a reliable signal. That meant help was even farther away than she had thought. She was on her own now. Buddy's growl deepened, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned back to the window, her hands trembling as she peered out. The figure was now closer, moving slowly and deliberately, just out of the light. Her mind screamed at her to lock the doors, to barricade herself in. But the door, the one Buddy was guarding, was still the only thing between them. And then, the figure stopped. Right outside the door. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her skin as she realized the figure wasn't just standing there, it was staring at her. She could feel its presence through the door, a suffocating weight that seemed to draw in all the light from the room. The silence that followed was deafening. Buddy let out a sharp, urgent bark, his eyes wide and alert. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as though it was waiting for something. Waiting for her. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Every instinct Sarah had screamed for her to run, to find a way out, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. No safe place to hide. All she had was Buddy. And all Buddy had was her. Suddenly, without warning, the figure moved again, swiftly, toward the door. The handle jiggled once more, this time more violently than before. Sarah's blood ran cold. The man was trying to break in. "Buddy, no!" Sarah cried, her voice trembling. But Buddy was already in motion, lunging at the door with a ferocity that stunned her. He was protecting her, just as he had always done. The door rattled again, and this time it sounded like it might give way. But Buddy's bark echoed loudly, and the man on the other side hesitated. Sarah held her breath, her eyes wide with fear and hope. Seconds stretched into eternity. The figure stepped back, as though reconsidering its next move. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt as though time itself had stopped. Buddy's stance didn't change, he remained a solid wall between Sarah and the door, eyes locked on the figure outside. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure turned and began to retreat. With slow, deliberate steps, it moved away from the door, vanishing back into the darkness. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. She had been sure, absolutely sure, that the door would break, that the figure would get in. But Buddy had stood his ground, had kept them safe, for now. The house was once again silent, save for the sound of Sarah's rapid breathing and Buddy's soft panting. She didn't know what had just happened, or why the man had backed away. But she knew this wasn't over. There was more to come. Buddy didn't move, his body still tense, his gaze fixed on the door. He was waiting, just like Sarah. Waiting for the next step. Waiting for the danger to return. And she knew it would. But they would face it together. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but the calm was far from comforting. Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart still pounding in her chest, as though the threat outside hadn't fully subsided. Buddy's stance didn't change, his muscles rigid and taut, his eyes still locked on the door. He wasn't about to let his guard down, not yet. Sarah knew that the man who had been outside her door hadn't left. Not completely. There was something off about the way he retreated, something in his movements that sent a chill crawling up her spine. He wasn't just some random stranger. There was a purpose behind his presence, a reason he was so intent on getting to her. She couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with the cryptic words he had spoken earlier, about not being safe. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. What did he want from her? Why was he so determined to get inside? The darkness outside seemed even more oppressive now, the quiet suffocating. Sarah moved slowly toward the window again, barely daring to look out, her heart in her throat. She pulled back the curtain just a little, just enough to peer outside. There was nothing. The street was empty. The only sound was the faint rustling of the leaves in the wind. But Sarah knew better than to trust that quiet. It was just a lull. She could feel it in her bones. Something was still out there, waiting, watching. Her fingers clenched tightly around the curtain as she pulled it back into place, her stomach twisted into knots. Buddy's low growl interrupted her thoughts, pulling her back to reality. He was still fixated on the door, his ears angled back, his body tense. His focus hadn't wavered. He wasn't ready to relax yet, and neither was she. "What do we do now, Buddy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Buddy didn't answer, of course. Instead, he just looked at her, his eyes full of trust and determination. It was as if he was telling her they weren't done yet, that the worst was still ahead. Sarah couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had to find a way to escape. The house wasn't safe. She couldn't stay locked in this room forever. But the thought of leaving terrified her. The figure outside had made it clear that she wasn't safe even here, in her own home. Buddy padded over to her, nuzzling her leg as if to comfort her. It worked, to some extent. His presence grounded her, and for a moment, she could breathe a little easier. But the gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach didn't go away. She had to act. She couldn't just wait around to be caught. She turned and walked toward the back door, peering through the blinds, trying to make out any movement in the yard. Her breath hitched when she thought she saw something move in the shadows, but when she squinted to get a better look, it was gone. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," Sarah muttered, but she knew deep down that she wasn't. Buddy trotted to her side, pressing his body against her legs, and looked up at her with his intense, unwavering gaze. He was ready. Ready to face whatever was out there. Ready to protect her. And that made Sarah feel a little braver. She wasn't alone. She had Buddy. And that meant everything. She turned away from the door and walked back to the living room, pacing the floor again, thinking. There had to be a way out. A plan. She couldn't just sit and wait for the inevitable to happen. As she moved toward the kitchen, a thought struck her: maybe she could make it to the neighbor's house. It was a long shot, but if she could get to the road and flag down a passing car, maybe someone would be able to help her. But the thought of leaving Buddy behind, of running while he stayed to guard the house, made her hesitate. He wouldn't let her go alone. He couldn't. Buddy had been her protector since the very first day she brought him home. He had saved her once before. But this time, the danger was different. It wasn't a random event. This was targeted. This was personal. The phone in her pocket vibrated, breaking her train of thought. Her heart skipped as she pulled it out, hoping for some kind of message or update from the police. Instead, it was a text message from her sister. "Sarah, I heard what happened. I'm worried. Are you okay?" Sarah stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. What could she say? How could she explain what was happening? The fear, the uncertainty, she didn't want to scare her sister more than she already was. But she couldn't lie either. Not safe. Someone's outside. Call the police. Her hands shook as she hit send, but before she could think more about it, she heard it. A sound that was impossible to ignore. A soft thud. Again. And then another. And another. Someone was coming. They were moving, getting closer to the back of the house now. Sarah's heart froze in her chest. This wasn't just one person anymore. The thuds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. There were multiple footsteps. She wasn't just being stalked. She was being surrounded. Buddy's ears pricked up, his body going rigid again as the sounds grew louder. He barked twice, sharp and commanding, his protective instincts kicking in. "No, Buddy," Sarah whispered urgently, her breath coming faster. "We have to stay quiet." But it was too late. They were here. The back door rattled once more. And this time, it didn't stop. The handle turned slowly, as though the intruders were testing it, just like the man had done before. Sarah felt the panic surge within her, her chest tightening. She didn't know how many of them there were, or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure: they were not going to stop until they got inside. And there was only one way to make it through the night. She had to act fast. "Buddy," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it's time." The dog looked up at her, his eyes full of understanding. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. And so was she. The air was thick with tension as Sarah and Buddy stood in the darkened room, listening intently to the sounds outside. The thuds were growing louder now, more urgent, like the intruders were testing their strength, making sure every corner of the house was covered. The sound of the back door handle rattling again sent a jolt of panic through Sarah, but she quickly forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let fear take over now, not when she needed to think clearly. Buddy growled low in his throat, his body braced, ready for whatever came next. Sarah had no illusions about the danger they were in. Whoever was out there wasn't going to give up easily. They had already shown that they would stop at nothing to get inside. And that meant Sarah had no choice but to fight back, to do whatever she could to protect herself and Buddy. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed the nearest object she could find, a heavy candlestick from the fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles white, and moved cautiously toward the door. Every step felt like an eternity. Every second felt like it might be the one where everything went wrong. She glanced down at Buddy, whose gaze remained fixed on the door, unblinking, unafraid. He was more than just her companion, he was her protector. And in that moment, Sarah knew that they were in this together. Whatever happened next, they would face it side by side. The rattling at the door stopped, and for a brief moment, the silence was deafening. But Sarah knew better than to relax. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Without warning, there was a loud crash, a sound so violent it shook the walls of the house. The back door had been forced open. Panic surged through Sarah's chest as she grabbed Buddy's collar, pulling him close to her. Stay quiet, she whispered, her voice trembling. Buddy's ears were flat against his head, his body tense and alert. He was waiting, just like Sarah, but his presence gave her the strength she needed. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She had Buddy, and together, they would get through this. The footsteps outside grew louder, the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Sarah's heart raced as she peeked through the crack in the door, trying to get a glimpse of what was happening outside. What she saw made her stomach drop. The shadows of multiple figures moved swiftly across the yard, their movements deliberate and calculated. There was no doubt now, they were coming for her. Buddy let out a sharp bark, a sound that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The figures outside froze for a moment, as if deciding what to do next. But then they moved forward again, unbothered by Buddy's warning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open, the hinges groaning in protest. She had mere seconds to react. In that moment, every instinct in her body screamed to run, to flee, to escape. But she knew she couldn't. There was nowhere to run. The door swung open slowly, revealing the dark figure of a man standing just beyond the threshold. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but his cold, calculating eyes were clearly visible. He didn't look surprised to find Sarah standing there, clutching the candlestick in her hand. It was as if he had been expecting her. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man's voice was low and menacing, sending a shiver through Sarah's spine. "Step aside. We're not here for you. We're here for what's inside." Sarah's mind raced. What did he mean by, what's inside? Was this about something more than her? Something inside the house? She had no idea, but she couldn't let him get any closer. "No," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're not coming in." Buddy growled again, his teeth bared, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in the man's eyes, uncertainty. The dog was a force to be reckoned with. But that didn't stop the man. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the door, his eyes narrowing. "I said step aside," he repeated, his tone colder this time. "This is your last warning." But Sarah wasn't going to back down. Not this time. She stood tall, her body shaking with fear, but her resolve stronger than ever. Buddy's growl intensified, and before Sarah could even think, the man lunged forward, pushing at the door with force. That was all it took. Buddy sprang into action. The dog launched himself at the man with a speed and strength that surprised even Sarah. His teeth found the man's arm, and he let out a furious snarl. The man cried out, his grip on the door faltering as he tried to shake Buddy off, but Buddy wasn't letting go. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, watching as Buddy fought to protect her. It was like watching a protector go to battle, his loyalty and courage unmatched. The man struggled to break free, but Buddy held tight, refusing to let him get any closer. "Buddy!" Sarah screamed, her voice frantic. "No! Get away from him!" But Buddy wasn't listening. He wasn't stopping. He had one job, and he was going to do it, no matter the cost. The man staggered back, clutching his arm, but before he could regain his balance, a second figure appeared from the shadows. Another man, this one taller and more imposing. He stepped forward with purpose, but Buddy, still growling fiercely, stood his ground. "Buddy, please," Sarah whispered again, more desperate this time. She knew what was happening. She knew Buddy was risking everything to protect her. But it was too dangerous. The second man advanced slowly, sizing up the situation, his eyes moving between Sarah and Buddy. And then, as though deciding something, he spoke. "Let's take the girl. We don't need the dog. The dog's too much trouble." The first man, still nursing his injured arm, scowled. "You sure about that?" Buddy growled in response, a deep, menacing sound that promised nothing but pain if they tried to get any closer. Sarah's pulse raced. The situation was spiraling out of control. She couldn't let Buddy keep fighting alone. Not like this. Not when they had so much to lose. The second man smirked. "We'll see about that." And just like that, the situation became even more dangerous. Sarah's mind whirled. There had to be a way out, but the only way to escape now would be for Buddy to stop fighting. But she couldn't ask him to do that. Not after everything he had already done for her. "Buddy," Sarah called, her voice cracking. "Please, we have to go. Please, we're leaving now." But would Buddy listen? Would he back down from this fight to save her? For a brief moment, everything stood still. The two men in front of Sarah and Buddy seemed to hesitate, sensing that this was no longer a fight they could easily win. The first man still clutched his bleeding arm, his expression dark with frustration, while the second man, taller and more menacing, studied the situation with calculating eyes. Sarah's heart raced, but she knew one thing: Buddy wasn't about to back down. Not now. "Buddy, please," Sarah whispered again, her voice barely more than a breath. She moved slowly, her eyes never leaving the men, but her focus entirely on the dog at her side. The seconds dragged by, each one more excruciating than the last. She could feel the weight of the tension pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Buddy was still growling, but his eyes flickered to Sarah, a split second of doubt. For just a moment, he hesitated. Sarah could see it in his eyes. He wasn't sure whether to stay and fight or to trust her, to listen to her and retreat. "Come on, Buddy," she whispered again, this time more urgently. "We need to go. We can do this together. Please." It was the plea in her voice that finally made the difference. Buddy's growl softened, and for the first time, his focus shifted from the two men to Sarah. His body relaxed, though only slightly, as if still on guard, but his eyes softened with trust. And then, as if sensing that the fight could go no further, Buddy backed away slowly. He didn't leave Sarah's side, but he was no longer lunging, no longer trying to attack. He moved toward Sarah, nudging her gently with his head, a silent message of reassurance. Sarah felt a rush of relief flood through her, but she didn't dare let her guard down. The men were still there, still watching, and there was no telling what they would do next. She had to move quickly. "Good boy," she whispered, her hand resting gently on Buddy's head. She could feel the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers, grounding her, giving her the strength she needed to think clearly. "We'll make it out. We'll get through this." The second man, who had been watching the scene unfold with a cold, calculating stare, finally spoke again, his voice laced with a hint of frustration. "This is your last chance, lady. You're coming with us, whether you want to or not." Sarah's stomach twisted with fear, but she couldn't show it. If she gave in now, if she showed weakness, they would win. And she couldn't afford that. Not with Buddy beside her. "No," Sarah said, her voice steady and resolute. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Buddy's low growl echoed through the room once more, and the men exchanged looks. The tension between them thickened, but neither of them made a move. They were calculating, trying to figure out their next step, but Sarah was running out of time. The longer they stood there, the more danger they were in. Buddy's gaze never wavered from the two men, and Sarah could feel his body tense again, ready for anything. He was waiting for her next move, just as he always had. But Sarah knew that the time for waiting was over. Without thinking twice, she made her decision. With one last look at Buddy, she grabbed the nearest object, a vase from the table, and hurled it at the back window with all her strength. The glass shattered in an instant, the sound of the crash ringing through the room. Before either man could react, Sarah grabbed Buddy's collar and pulled him toward the broken window. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. She had to move now. Buddy hesitated for a split second, but Sarah urged him forward, her voice calm but firm. "Come on, Buddy. We're getting out of here. We're not giving up." The second man lunged toward them, but Sarah was already climbing through the window, Buddy following closely behind her, jumping through with surprising agility for such a large dog. They were outside now, and the cold air hit Sarah like a slap in the face. But she didn't care. She wasn't looking back. She just had to keep moving, keep going. The yard was dark, the shadows from the trees stretching long in the moonlight. Sarah's mind raced as she scanned the area, searching for an escape. There was a dirt path that led to the road, and she knew if she could make it there, she might have a chance. Buddy stayed close to her side, his body tense and alert as they moved through the yard. The sound of footsteps behind them told her they weren't free yet, but she didn't dare slow down. Not for a second. A shout rang out behind them. "Get them!" Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she heard the men start to follow, their voices angry and filled with malice. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every instinct in her body told her to run, and that's exactly what she did. They reached the dirt path, and Sarah pushed herself harder, urging Buddy to keep up. She could feel the distance between her and the men widening, but she knew it wasn't enough. She could hear them behind her, getting closer, their heavy boots pounding against the earth. The road was just ahead, and Sarah could almost taste freedom. But then, she heard a familiar sound, a vehicle approaching in the distance. Her heart leapt with hope, and she pushed forward with renewed energy, pulling Buddy along with her. The headlights of the car grew brighter, and Sarah felt a surge of relief. She was almost there. Buddy barked once, a sharp, warning bark, and Sarah turned to see the men slowing down behind them, clearly unwilling to get too close now that they knew help was on the way. The car pulled up just as the men reached the end of the path. Sarah barely hesitated as she flagged down the vehicle, her voice hoarse as she yelled, "Help! Please!" The car screeched to a halt, and the driver's window rolled down. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, stared at Sarah for a moment, taking in the scene. "Are you okay? Get in." Without a second thought, Sarah pulled Buddy into the car, her heart still pounding in her chest. As soon as the door slammed shut, the man floored the gas pedal, and they sped off into the night, leaving the two men behind. As they drove away, Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from relief. She had made it. She had made it because of Buddy. She wasn't alone. Buddy lay down at her feet, his body still tense, but his eyes soft with exhaustion. He had saved her. He had always been her protector. And in that moment, as the car sped away from danger, Sarah knew that she would never forget what Buddy had done for her. He wasn't just a dog. He was family. And they had made it through the night together. As the car disappeared into the night, Sarah looked down at Buddy, his head resting on her lap, his eyes closing in exhaustion. She had survived, not because of the odds, but because of her unbreakable bond with the dog who had saved her life. Together, they had made it through the darkest of moments. But this wasn't just the end of their story, it was a reminder that loyalty, courage, and love can overcome any obstacle. Buddy had shown Sarah that no matter how impossible the situation seemed, there's always hope. And it's that hope that will carry them forward into whatever comes next. As they drove off into the safety of the unknown, one thing was certain: they would face the future, together, no matter what. If you want to hear more heart-stopping, inspiring stories like this, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more tales of courage, loyalty, and the incredible bond between humans and their pets. Don't miss out, because every moment counts.